Here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we turn now to a stunning new exposé published today in The Intercept about the elite military unit SEAL Team 6. Known as the president's own, the group is best known for killing Osama bin Laden, as well as other high-profile rescue missions, including that of Captain Richard Phillips from the Maersk, Alabama. But Intercept national security reporter Matthew Cole reveals a darker side of the celebrated group. Cole spent more than 2 years investigating accounts of ghastly atrocities committed by members of the unit, including mutilating corpses, skinnings, and attempted beheadings. According to sources, senior command staff were aware of the misconduct but did little to stop it and often helped to cover it up. In the article, The Crimes of SEAL Team 6, Cole quotes one former leader as saying, "You can't win an investigation on us. You don't whistleblow on the teams. And when you win on the battlefield, you don't lose investigations." Well, for more, we're joined by Matthew Cole. Welcome to Democracy Now!
Thank you, Amy.
Talk about what you found, what we don't know about, and there's much we don't know about this unit.
Yeah, I think the biggest takeaway is that after 15 years of war and unquestionable successes on the battlefield, there have been virtually no accounts of SEAL Team 6 outside of the parameters of heroism. And they've become almost mythic in terms of the American public and how popular they are. And what was missing from those accounts was that after 15 years of continuous warfare, very personal, up-close warfare, there were some very, very dark things that occurred in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere that were largely suppressed and hidden from the public and actually from the military itself as a way of protecting the command and those who had gone over the line to commit war crimes.
So talk about the bombing that occurred. You write about it in the opening part of this very lengthy article in Afghanistan.
Yeah, so in March of 2002, there was a operation that was JSOC had video footage of a tall man in white garb.
That's Joint Special Operations Command.
Joint Special Operations Command, and saw someone that they thought was bin Laden and was afraid he was going to get away. And they didn't have much intelligence, but they had the notion that he was. People around him were showing deference, and he was leaving a compound. So they sent SEAL Team 6 and some helicopters to go investigate, basically to do an interdiction. But fearing that the convoy was going to get across the border into Pakistan before the SEALs would get there, JSOC officers ordered a bombing, and they dropped 2 bombs on the convoy. And they killed a lot of people pretty quickly, almost instantaneously. As the helicopters were coming down onto the scene, they then fired the helicopter guns, miniguns, onto the remaining survivors, regardless of whether they were armed, because it was all presumed that everyone there was Al-Qaeda. When the SEALs got down onto the ground and inspected, what they found right away was that it was all civilians, and that the few men who were armed were carrying family weapons, because in Afghanistan it's traditional and customary for each male, at least, and certainly each family, to have one weapon. And in fact, what they saw were dead women and children along with men. And it was a horrific sight for the SEALs who were on their first deployment in the war. Remember, this is shortly after 9/11 and shortly after the war in Afghanistan begins, and they weren't veterans yet of those kind of wars. And according to my sources, one of the officers who was on the mission allegedly mutilated one of the victims, one of the civilian victims, after he had been killed. And it was so upsetting to his teammate in the unit that he then came back and reported it to his leader. And what transpires then is a meeting with everyone in the unit who was enlisted, and not the officers, the next day to discuss battlefield ethics. How are we going to treat the dead? How are we going to conduct ourselves in the battlefield? And the decision in the meeting was, hey, one person who was there told me, we shoot them and we move on. If they're bad guys, we shoot them and we move on. That's fine. But we don't mutilate. That's not part of the game. And they essentially ostracized the officer who they believe had done so. But they didn't turn him in. They didn't report it. They didn't tell anyone. It was strictly within the unit. And that's one of the things.
And the officer's name was?
His name was Lieutenant Commander Vic Hyder. Just to be clear, in the article on the record, he denies that he stomped this man's head in. But that story really becomes a sort of blueprint for how SEAL Team 6 has kept war crimes, excessive violence, criminal brutality a secret for 15 years. They keep it in-house, and they have their own system of justice, prison rules, if you will. And there is a real divide between the officers who have the commission by law for law and order and the enlisted who make up most of the command.
Can you talk about the SEAL Team 6 officer who made so-called bleed-out videos?
He wasn't an officer. He was an enlisted. He was enlisted. He was a very troubled SEAL, a member of Red Team, Red Squadron, who filmed. His job, he had a responsibility, which was to film the aftermath of an operation for intelligence gathering. So he had a camera. It was part of the normal course of duties. After an operation would end, he went around and filmed to identify. Later they could try to identify who had been killed in terms of the militants. And he began doing what was described to me as bleed-out videos, and what were known as bleed-out videos within the team at the time. He would bring them back, and having on the battlefield, having taunted the people who were dying, essentially telling them that they couldn't die yet, they weren't going to heaven, they weren't going to see Allah, there were no virgins, and then bring the videos back, and then spend time reviewing them, rewinding them over and over with a group, and doing a countdown to watch the last few moments of a person's life as they expired. And that was done. This wasn't done in some corner of, some dark hole in Afghanistan. It was done at Bagram Air Base in front of a lot of people. No one would do anything about it. It was not considered morally reprehensible. And that was, we use that as an example because in and of itself, it's not illegal, but it gives you a sense of sort of the dark nature of what this war brought for members of elite special operations forces, in particular SEAL Team 6.
Talk about what happened to U.S. Navy SEAL Neil Roberts.
So Neil Roberts was the first SEAL Team 6 member and the first special operations soldier to die after 9/11. He was killed he fell off the back of a helicopter during Operation Anaconda in early March of 2002 in eastern Afghanistan, and there later became known as the Battle for Roberts Ridge. It was an effort to save him, but Roberts fell off, was killed fairly quickly by al-Qaeda fighters who had already established a stronghold on the mountaintop. And Predator drone feed later sees one of the fighters standing over him, attempting to behead him, and in fact mutilated him very significantly. And so when his body was brought back to Bagram and his teammates found out, not only had they lost their teammate and pierced their sense of invincibility, which is appropriately built up for your best warriors, they were devastated by the manner and the gruesome manner in which his body had been treated. And so Objective Bull, which happens about 18 hours later, we don't know, but we believe that the alleged stomping in and mutilation of the civilian, the unarmed man, and Objective Bull was very much...
Objective Bull is the story you described before.
Right.
That's the operation.
That it was the beginning of what was sort of a tit for tat against al-Qaeda, which was, you do this to ours, we'll do this to yours. But the Roberts' death and the manner of his death really shook up SEAL Team 6. And although there have been an enormous amount of accounts of the Battle of Roberts Ridge and some of the heroism and valor in trying to get him back, and there were others who died.
Others who died didn't die as it was originally thought and survived and then died.
Right. And so, but what was never told was this incident that happens 18 hours later. And looking back, it's easy to see why they wouldn't tell the story. But the Pentagon itself, they had announced a week after the bombing in Objective Bull that they had killed civilians. But even then, they said that they were affiliated somehow with Al-Qaeda. So they left the impression that although they killed civilians, it was a justifiable bombing. In fact, it was only civilians, and they had no intelligence whatsoever.
It was a wedding party?
They were on their way to a wedding party, yes.
Where does Britt Slabinski fit into this picture?
Well, that's very interesting. Britt Slabinski is sort of at the heart of all of this, although we have to remember that he was an enlisted SEAL and not an officer, although he became a very senior enlisted. Britt Slabinski was on Roberts Ridge. It was Neil Roberts was part of his team. He was the leader of the team that went back to get Neil Roberts. He won a Navy Cross for his efforts on the top of Takur Ghar, which was the mountaintop in eastern Afghanistan. And he was in the meeting at Bagram after Objective Bull, in which the discussion about how Vic Hyder had behaved and what he had done during Objective Bull was determined that was just not how SEAL Team 6 was going to operate. Slabinski was devastated by Roberts' death. And frankly, according to sources who spoke with him at the time, he sought revenge. He wanted to go back out on the battlefield and get payback. And we unearthed, in the course of reporting, some exclusive audio that had never been found before of Slabinski giving an interview to an author who was writing a book about Roberts Ridge, in which he describes a third operation that happens after Objective Bull, in which they ambushed a group of Al-Qaeda fighters who had been on top of Takur Ghar, who had been in the Battle of Roberts Ridge. And he was a sniper who led a sniper team at the time, and they killed roughly 18 or 19 Al-Qaeda fighters in eastern Afghanistan in mid-March 2002. And in the audio, what you hear him talk about is the operation as payback and revenge, essentially, for what happened on Roberts Ridge, as a way for the guys and his men to get their confidence back, as I think he says is to get back in the saddle again.
Let's go to the SEAL Team 6 member, Britt Slabinski, here describing the aftermath of an operation to take down a convoy they believed was filled with Al-Qaeda fighters trying to escape to Pakistan. Slabinski and the team of snipers had killed, nearly 20 Al-Qaeda fighters.
After I shot this dude in the head, there was a guy that had his feet sticking out of some little rut or something over here. I mean, he was dead, but I mean, you know, people got nervous. I shot him about 20 times in the legs, and every time you kick him or shoot him, he would kip up, and you could see his body twitch and all that. It was like a game, like, yeah, look at this dude. And the guy was just, you know, twitched again. It was, yeah, good therapy. Yeah, I'll bet it was really good therapy for everybody that was there.
So that's Navy SEAL Team 6 member Britt Slabinski, this audio being played publicly for the first time that you got at the Intercept. And the significance of this?
Well, I think what it does is it gives you a window into the mindset of someone who became a very senior. First of all, he was, after the Battle of Roberts Ridge, he became a legendary SEAL. He had a Navy Cross. He was a hero. He became a very influential member of SEAL Team 6, and at a command that is referred to and known as an enlisted mafia, run effectively by the enlisted SEALs who spend a decade or more in the unit. He was a top leader, and as a result, he ended up in a position running a squadron, and there were a series of events that occurred that I report exclusively for the first time about the fallout of his leadership. And what you get to see, what you get to hear in that is the mindset. I mean, the thing that was most disturbing to me, I think, in listening to it, was the gleefulness in his voice, that it was therapy for him. And that, I think, gives us some understanding. And as I was talking to a former senior leader of SEAL Team 6 about that tape, he had never heard it, and I showed him the transcript. And one of the things he said, what's so scary is that this guy undoubtedly influenced so many of our guys with that kind of attitude.
Matthew Cole, one of the most disturbing forms of atrocities the SEAL Team 6 committed was called canoeing. If you can talk about that, and then talk about whether you believe Osama bin Laden was canoed.
Yeah, so I would say one of the, if not the darkest secret in the last 15 years is that over the course of the wars, SEAL Team 6, as well as other elements of JSOC, were involved in something called canoeing, which is a form of firing a bullet in the top of the forehead that splits the head open in the most gruesome manner and leaves, frankly, the brain matter exposed and looks like puts the top of the head in the shape of a V with a negative space that looks like a canoe would fit in there, or that a canoe went through it. And it can happen incidentally in battle, and it does happen incidentally in battle. What I found was that for a period of years, SEAL Team 6 was they photographed their dead for documentation and preservation. And for a period of years, canoed dead took up an enormous amount of space in that catalog, and it was not mathematically possible. And what my sources said were, it became a sport. When you shoot a person when they're dead or dying at very close range for the sake of seeing the gruesome results.
And Osama bin Laden?
Well, what happened to Osama bin Laden was hiding sort of in plain sight. The man who claims that he killed Osama bin Laden, Robert O'Neill, did a long interview in Esquire in 2013, in which he described what bin Laden's face looked like after he shot him 3 times in the face and forehead. And there it is, without using the word canoe, he describes this gruesome scene of splitting the top of his skull open into a V, with the negative space in the shape of a V, and his brain matter exposed. And one of the points that I make in the story is that SEAL Team 6 then branded Osama bin Laden. It's an act of dominance, and it is a form of sport, and it's reflexive. And it doesn't, in this case, it does not necessarily mean that Robert O'Neill committed a war crime, but there is no question that the ritualistic manner in which, and the frequency in which it occurred, and the fact that it had no military necessity was criminal.
You believe that bin Laden was killed unarmed and in the dark?
Absolutely. I think one of the things that my story presents fairly conclusively is that the order from the beginning was to kill him regardless of the situation inside. And in fact, one of my sources, who was a senior member, said, kill him, bring the body back. That was the order.
We're going to do part 2 of this conversation, post online at democracynow.org. Matthew Cole will link to your piece at The Intercept. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report, as we turn to part 2 of our discussion about the stunning new exposé published in The Intercept about the elite military unit SEAL Team 6. It's called The President's Own, the group best known for killing Osama bin Laden, as well as other high-profile rescue missions, including that of Captain Richard Phillips from the Maersk, Alabama. But Intercept national security reporter Matthew Cole reveals a darker side of the celebrated group. Cole spent more than 2 years investigating accounts of atrocities committed by members of the unit, including mutilating corpses, skinnings, attempted beheadings, and canoeings, which we'll talk about in a moment. According to sources, senior command staff were aware of the misconduct, but did little to stop it, often helped to cover it up. The article is called The Crimes of SEAL Team 6. Cole quotes one former leader as saying, you can't win an investigation on us, you don't whistleblow on the teams, and when you win on the battlefield, you don't lose investigations. Matthew Cole, thank you for staying with us for part 2 of this conversation. And I want to start where we left off on Democracy Now!, talking about the killing of Osama bin Laden. But now we have a little time, so take us through what happened in May of 2011.
Well, I think the first place to start is that despite what the Obama administration was at pains to try to say in the hours and days after the raid, was that from the beginning, the order to the SEALs was to go in and kill Osama bin Laden, and it went further than that. The order was to go in and kill all males on the compound, regardless of whether they were armed. It was an assassination, an execution, however you'd like to call it. It was murder. And the SEALs went out and did it very effectively. And what we know is that despite the fact that...
You write that even before the killing, that two of the Team 6 members, Matt Bissonnette and Robert O'Neill, had an argument that had to be broken up by their fellow SEALs about who would tell the story after.
Right. So the two SEALs who have come out from that raid and given firsthand accounts, one in the form of a book, the other in a magazine article, and then in a Fox News special identifying himself as the shooter, were involved in an argument prior to the raid, before they had even gone to Afghanistan and Pakistan, over how they were going to work together to sell the story afterwards. And it had to be separated by their teammates because it wasn't a physical fight. They got into a screaming match. And lo and behold, after the raid, they, of course, were the first to get out of the unit. And there was, as one of their former bosses said to me, they were in a race to write a book and make money off of the operation. And so after their accounts came out, in addition to the Obama administration's account, everything sort of got muddled in terms of what happened. And one of the impressions that was left was that bin Laden was killed because he was a threat, because he hadn't laid down on the ground and said, "I surrender." But that was always fiction. He was killed because there was an order to kill him no matter what. And he was killed by a SEAL who was the first to encounter him. He was unarmed. He was wearing, effectively, his pajamas. He was standing with two female relatives to the side on each side of him. And he was put down with two shots, one to the chest and a second which glanced off his hip as he fell back onto the floor. And that's a key point, because he falls down on the floor, and then the man who says that he ended bin Laden's life, Robert O'Neill, and no one disputes that he put the bullets into bin Laden and effectively ended his life. But the way O'Neill tells the story is that bin Laden was standing, had his wife in front of him, holding his wife's shoulders as a sort of shield, and has a weapon nearby. And so that he's scanning the scene and making the determination that, based on his training, that this man is a threat and he can be killed. And so he shoots him, he drops, and then he puts a third bullet in his forehead. And by his own words, he describes in Esquire magazine a canoeing, which is the intentional splitting open of the skull with a round to the top of the forehead. And what my reporting found was that he wasn't standing. There was no threat. He would have died had he not been shot by Mr. O'Neill. He was on the ground, bleeding out from the shot to his chest. And what was interesting, actually, is how much I learned over the 2 years, how much animosity was directed towards the two SEALs who spoke out and exaggerated or lied, whatever you want to say, falsehoods. They spun a story to make themselves heroic and make money off of it, and it wasn't accurate. And so there's an enormous amount of animosity inside the unit at these two guys.
What did Matt Bissonnette say? You say that he lied and No Easy Day.
His book, his account effectively of how bin Laden died is actually mostly accurate. The issue is that he actually wasn't a witness. He makes it sound as though he was there and next to O'Neill, and with O'Neill fires the last shots that killed bin Laden. In fact, he was much further back down the line, comes in later. But prior to that, his team was to go after bin Laden's courier, and they killed him. Both in the book, but then also in the official debrief that SEAL Team 6 did with a lawyer in Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan. He lied and said that he had killed the courier, and in fact he had not. And that became a big deal because that's something even within their code, that's something you don't do. You don't take credit for another man's work. And so in the subsequent years afterwards, their teammates viewed that lie, that he had killed the courier outside in the adjacent compound as the beginning of Bissonnet's effort to shape his story so that he could sell it. Because you need to have drama whenever you're selling a myth. And in the case of both O'Neill and Bissonnet, and in SEAL Team 6 at large, that's what we have here. We have a set of myths. We have narratives that are filled with, let's say 75% of the facts are true, but a quarter of them are false or omitted, and it makes a big difference in terms of understanding what really happened.
Matthew, you're right. The beauty of what they've constructed, said a former teammate about how Bissonnet and O'Neill cornered the market on the bin Laden raid, quote, is that there is only one guy, essentially, who can come forward and say they're lying, and he won't ever talk.
Yeah, so that's in reference to what is known as sort of the lead assaulter on the mission, whose nickname in the unit is Red. And he was the first to get up the stairs onto the third floor of Osama bin Laden's house, and is the first to see bin Laden peeking through the doorway of his bedroom. And he fires 2 shots into bin Laden, and he then waits to see what happens, and they slowly get to the door. One of the things that's interesting, just as an aside, in learning about special operations and SEALs, is that there's not a whole lot of running. They have a whole terminology which is don't run to your death, walk to your death. You take your time to make decisions, and that's one of the things, their training is their brilliance is at the tactical level. It's minutia. And so he did exactly as he was trained to do, which was to go slowly to the doorway and see and assess whether or not the person he shot was still a threat. And he says to the debrief and to the team later, he wasn't a threat. So he then wraps his arms around 2 of the women who are in the room who are becoming hysterical. And that's described in both O'Neill and Bissonnet's book. And what's funny is they give him credit for doing something very heroic. That had they been wearing suicide vests, he put himself on top of them and would have absorbed the blast. But what they've left out is that the only reason why he made that decision to do that was because he had already determined that bin Laden was either dead or was going to die in a matter of moments. And he is the one who effectively is the only one who could come out and say, here's what really happened, because he was the first in the room, the first up, and the one who fired the shots. And one of their teammates said to me, that quote that you just read, which is, there was a cleverness to what O'Neill and Bissonnet did to make it so that it's just, they're not going to have people contradicting them in public. And as a result, they've made a lot of money. And
why won't he contradict them?
Well, because he is a silent professional. I mean, in a world where silence is supposed to be part of the norm, he sticks by it and is still in.
So explain how, as you put it, Osama bin Laden was canoed.
So essentially, O'Neill, who is the second to fire shots on bin Laden, puts 2 rounds in his face or his forehead. And after he's down at a very close range, O'Neill fires a 3rd round, and that round hits him in the top of the forehead. And that's canoeing requires a certain location in the head. And by his own description, by O'Neill's own description, it split open his head and exposed his brain matter and split open his head in a V shape. And that V shape is the canoe. And what I know, and it's not in the story, but what I know is that his face was so disfigured when they brought his body back to Jalalabad and they took him out of the body bag. They had him nude with only his genitals and his face covered, because genitals out of respect, and face because it was so disfigured. They put a small towel or tissue over his face, and splitting his head open disfigured him so much that the SEALs in the compound couldn't recognize him. He was unrecognizable, and so it required one of the SEALs who was there, who spoke Arabic, to go around and get confirmation, double confirmation, that this was Osama bin Laden. So there was a practical side to it too, but splitting his face open, I think, is very safe to say a significant reason why the Obama administration never released the photo of bin Laden's face. It was just too gruesome to show.
As they had released the photo, for example, of capturing Saddam Hussein.
Right, or his sons, killing his sons. They put out Uday and Hussein pictures shortly after he was killed. I mean, it was a curious thing to do, given what you knew would be conspiracy theories and questions about whether he had even been killed. But his face was just too gruesome to show.
So you say bin Laden was killed unarmed and in the dark?
Absolutely. He was killed 15 minutes after the mission began. No lights, could hear certain things, but there wasn't a lot of noise. I mean, their suppressed weapons are very quiet. And he dies with he has 2 weapons in the room that they find later in a search. They have no bullets in them. They're essentially trophies. Certainly wasn't carrying them or holding on to them. He died in the dark, in his pajamas, listening to the sounds of people moving through the house. And with very little, he sticks his head out of his room, and he gets shot. And
what is your sense of why the Obama administration wanted him dead, not alive?
Well, I think it was just a heck of a lot easier to not have to worry about the spectacle of a trial, that the story was over and a case closed, and it certainly would be easier to sell to the American people that to some end part of the war was over. So, I still think that there are questions that remain unanswered about the mission, the operation, and how what the administration knew and about his location. But by and large, I think the order to kill him was just to have everything tied up neatly.
Matthew Cole, as you talk about really in some of these cases for the first time what this unit has done, SEAL Team 6, and you talk about canoeing in general, there are those who wanted to expose this, like a CIA paramilitary officer's attempt to blow the whistle on this. Explain what happens to someone who wants to challenge the practices.
So in 2008, a former Navy SEAL Team 6 member himself, who was retired and went to the CIA as a paramilitary officer, named Richard Smethers, was upset with some of the conduct that SEAL Team 6 was up to in the end of the year in 2008. He was upset about civilians being killed, unarmed people being killed, excessive violence, and an overall failure of leadership at SEAL Team 6 in not policing their men. And so he was put forward by a small group of CIA officers at a base in northeast Afghanistan to complain and to blow the whistle effectively on SEAL Team 6. And it began a very rancorous fight between SEAL Team 6 and CIA in Afghanistan over what to do. And SEAL Team 6 said very quickly he needed to be quiet. And his response was, I'll go to the press. And in fact, I think specifically, he threatened to go to the New York Times. And SEAL Team 6 told the CIA, if this guy goes public, we will end his career. He will lose his clearances. He will never work again. And also told the CIA, hey, we're working together here. If this stuff comes out, or there are investigations into war crimes or excessive criminality and excessive violence and brutality, it'll hurt all of us. And so the CIA agreed to send him home. He was up for going back home anyway. There was a natural change both with him and with the SEAL unit that was in at the time. And so the two sides said, listen, we will calm things down. You send him home, keep him quiet, and we will go about taking care of our guys. And what happened shortly after that is Admiral Bill McRaven, who was then the commander of the Joint Special Operations Command, had come in, and the complaints from the Afghan government about night raids and civilians, unarmed civilians being killed, had grown. The complaints about them had grown loud inside Afghanistan, and politically Karzai was hitting U.S. forces. So McRaven orders a stand down, about a 2-week stop in almost all special operations forces. And a lot of that was meant to pull the leash on SEAL Team 6, and he issued new guidelines in terms of how they operated in country. And those guidelines were, in a lot of ways, done to protect SEALs. You know, it is important to remember that in all of this, most members of SEAL Team 6, the majority of SEAL Team 6, did not commit war crimes and atrocities. This was more like a persistent virus, but a significant number did, and they had gotten out of control, and the man who led them at a very high level understood that. And so McRaven orders this stand down, gives them new rules, and the Smethers issue, the whistleblowing, just sort of fades off into the sunset. And that was the only case. It was the only time there was someone who had whistleblown on SEAL Team 6 where there was some threat and they were worried about being exposed for what they were doing on the battlefield. And I think the lesson you can learn from that is that they go to great lengths to make sure that it goes away, and it hurts. You know, their view to the CIA, I think, was really interesting. It doesn't just hurt us. It hurts you. It'll hurt the administration. It'll hurt the war. And I think that's a very compelling argument for people who work in the government or the military when you're in the middle of a war. And so it's swept under the rug. And that's the kind of thing that has occurred at a small level for SEAL Team 6 and at a bigger level. And that's really what the story is trying to attempted, and I hope succeeded, in uncovering these various levels in which it was obvious that things were going on that were illegal, that were immoral, that were unconscionable. And they were either quietly and implicitly, tacitly encouraged, or people in charge just looked the other way.
Matthew, talk about how Linda Norgrove fits into this picture and who she was.
So Linda Norgrove was a aid worker working in Afghanistan in 2010 when she was kidnapped by factions of the Taliban or militants in northeast Afghanistan. And she was taken from a road and sent up into a very mountainous place, and was a UK citizen. Was actually from Scotland originally. And the only unit that was capable, both at the time and in general, to operate in Afghanistan for a high-risk rescue mission was SEAL Team 6. So the British government requested that SEAL Team 6 go save her. And as SEAL Team 6 was putting the mission together, the British government kept giving her location with a very precise, with total precision. And SEAL Team 6 said, how do you know where she is with such precision in a place where we've been operating for years, and you just don't get that kind of fidelity in such short time? And the British government disclosed, according to my sources, to 4 sources, that she was working for MI6 and had been essentially working undercover for British intelligence. And so they had some form of tracking on her and knew her exact location. And that was a bona fides that SEAL Team 6 needed to feel comfortable with sending their men out to find her at this location. And she was unfortunately killed in the raid unintentionally by SEAL Team 6 as a firefight broke out when they arrived. And the initial story that the SEALs presented to their superiors and to the British government was that she had been killed by one of her captors who had detonated a suicide vest that he was wearing, and it blew up and she was nearby and it killed her. Well, it turned out that that was not what happened. And in fact, what had occurred was that one of the SEALs, a young SEAL operative on his first hostage rescue mission, had thrown a grenade and hadn't seen her, and initially hadn't reported that he had thrown the grenade. And what came there was a slow, so I should say a fast cover-up by 3 members of SEAL Team 6 who were on the mission to avoid the embarrassment of what had just happened, which was that, in fact, the captor had not killed her, SEAL Team 6 had. And that was another case where the punishment, the way the command tried to hold itself accountable was considered insufficient. And so Admiral McRaven stepped in and conducted what's called an admiral's mast, which was unprecedented. And SEAL Team 6 is it has a law unto itself. It's in its own world. It's its own tribe. And one of the things that it uses is a Navy system called non-judicial punishment. And what it allows you to do is to punish an individual without any form of court-martial. It's a reprimand, and you can be removed from a unit, but it saves your career. And he stepped in and conducted a massed and punished throughout 3 members of SEAL Team 6. And it was considered this total insult that the admiral had to come to the command and conduct a proceeding that normally would be done by a captain. And but I think one of the things I say in the article is that this was very dramatic in the world of SEAL Team 6. But even within their own mores, 2 of the 3 later returned to the unit. So you don't get justice or accountability at SEAL Team 6. It just doesn't happen. It hasn't happened. I have sources that argued that it hasn't happened since they were started in 1980. And I think one of the motivations for sources to talk to me over the last couple of years has been their frustration, some of them over 2 decades, to get the command's leadership to hold itself accountable for what it's been doing.
You talk a lot about Britt Slabinski, the legendary member of SEAL Team 6. Talk about the story of this man who was a Navy Cross winner, telling his men he wanted a head on a platter.
Yeah, so in 2007, Britt Slabinski was the Blue Squadron Master Chief, which is one of the assault teams within SEAL Team 6. And they deployed to Afghanistan late in the year into Kandahar and Helmand, which at the time was, and still is, an incredibly violent, incredibly destabilized section of the country where the Taliban effectively rule. They had encountered an enormous amount of resistance and violence from the Taliban. And at some point during that deployment, he tells his men that he wants a head on a platter. Now, one of his men interpreted that remark as an order, as a direction to be given and followed through. And so on December 17th, 2007, they conduct a raid into a compound in Helmand province, killing 3 or 4 Taliban fighters, and in the aftermath, one of the young operators begins to try to cut off the head of one of the fighters. And the officer of the unit, who was Slabinski's superior, happens to be on the mission, and he walks by a window of a compound and peers in and sees this young operator standing over this dead fighter, and what he believes is the sawing action over this man's neck. And he sends Britt Slabinski, who is his senior enlisted leader, into the room to inquire what happens. And Slabinski comes back and says, no foul play. He was just trying to take gear off of the man's body, and nothing was untoward. But the officer doesn't believe it. He still has suspicions, thinks there was something wrong with what he saw. And so he goes back and reports it to the command, to his leadership at SEAL Team 6, and demands an investigation. And 2 subsequent investigations, first one for JSOC, which is effectively an internal investigation, and one for the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, the federal law enforcement organization that the Navy has that conducts criminal investigations. NCIS. Find no evidence to support a violation of the law of armed conflict. And part of what they found was that Slabinski tells his story, the officer tells his story, and the young SEAL who was alleged to have done this refused to testify. He took the fifth and was moved out of the country, was sent home. And my sources, from the beginning, there was never a question of whether this operator had mutilated this guy. In fact, he had severed a good portion of this man's head off before he was stopped by Slabinski. The real question became, why had he done it? And after some internal inquiries at the command, what became clear was that he believed that he was following an order. And when Britt Slabinski was up for a promotion a few years later, they did 2 informal internal inquiries. You can't call them investigations. And again, these words, they mean something in terms of understanding how subtle SEAL Team 6 operates. They were inquiries. And they were inquiries because there's no paper record of this. And what they found was that during that deployment, Slabinski had, A, said that he wanted a head on a platter. Some of the men who were more veteran and savvy saw him as speaking metaphorically and didn't pay attention. The younger ones didn't. B, that this young man, this young SEAL, and by the way, he wasn't young. He was young for SEAL Team 6. When you join SEAL Team 6, you already have 6 years of experience as a SEAL. So he wasn't a kid. He was just a kid relative to someone like Slabinski, and impressionable and easily influenced. He believes he's following an order. So after a mission, he tries to cut a man's head off. And Slabinski tries to protect him, but also protect himself. And the inquiry finds that he was no question that this was a result of Slabinski's leadership. And then they find, additionally, that there was another operation in which Slabinski ordered all the men on the operation shot, regardless of whether they were armed. Now, that order is illegal. It is effectively, it's tantamount to ordering murder or an execution, precisely as the SEALs were ordered in the bin Laden raid to do. As it happened in that operation, a subsequent investigation found that all the people who were killed in that operation had been armed. But the order itself was illegal. And so in 2010, Britt Slabinski was told that he could never come back to SEAL Team 6. He was not allowed to be back. And one of my sources, who was a former senior member of the command, said to me, something I'm paraphrasing roughly, but he said, to this day, Slabinski thinks that the guys turned on him. And they did, but what they didn't do was turn him in. And that was, to me, that was so telling. Their justice was to throw him out of the unit. That's their justice. It wasn't to bring him up on charges or suggest that he should retire or provide any other sense of accountability. It was to make sure he couldn't be among them. And so what happens? He is then requested by someone who was close to him, who had been another SEAL Team 6 officer, who was in Afghanistan during the Roberts Ridge and Neil Roberts' death and that deployment, who was one of the investigators and the senior SEAL Team 6 member on the ground when the young SEAL had tried to behead the Taliban. He, upon learning that Slabinski had been blackballed out of the unit for substantiated allegations of war crimes or criminal activity, what does he do? He requests that he be promoted and come in as his senior enlisted leader at his command. And that man is currently a 2-star admiral, Rear Admiral Tim Szymanski, and he is now in charge of all SEALs in the United States. So that really gets at the heart of what is at this story, which is that they knew what was going on. When they had an opportunity to do something about it, not only did they not do anything about it, they effectively encouraged it by promoting their own. There was no punishment whatsoever. And Britt Slabinski is really, his story, which is really a tragic one, and it starts in 2002 on Roberts Ridge, and it extends all the way out to being blackballed by SEAL Team 6, is really indicative of sort of the worst of what can happen at a unit like this.
But he is awarded a Navy Cross.
He was awarded a Navy Cross, and that won't ever be taken away from him. And he, by all accounts, what he did on the top of Takur Ghar during Roberts Ridge to try to retrieve his teammate was heroic. And it's not, what happened subsequently is not meant to take away from what he did on this day in this mission, but the command had opportunities, specifically with Britt Slabinski. The command had opportunities. They understood that he had deep psychological scars from what happened on Roberts Ridge. And they knew he was troubled. And I think the audio that you played earlier, is indicative of someone who does not have his head right. And I shared the transcript of it with 2 of his former bosses who were horrified that he said this, in not only that he said it, but that he said it in an interview to an author, and that the younger men around him were undoubtedly influenced by that kind of talk, by that kind of bravado and bloodlust.
Let's go back to that clip, which you played in part one of the conversation. Again, it's being played here publicly for the first time. Team 6 member at the time, Britt Slabinski, describing the aftermath of an operation to take down a convoy that they believed was filled with al-Qaeda fighters trying to escape to Afghanistan. Slabinski and a team of snipers had killed nearly 20 al-Qaeda fighters.
After I shot this dude in the head, there was a guy that had his feet, just his feet sticking out of some little rut or something over here. I mean, he was dead, but I mean, you know, people got nervous. I shot him about 20 times in the legs, and every time you kick him or shoot him, he would kip up, and you could see his body twitch and all that. It was like a game, like, hey, look at this dude. And the guy was just, you know, twitch again. It was, yeah, good therapy. Yeah, I'll bet it was really good therapy for everybody that was there.
So that is, at the time, SEAL Team 6 member Britt Slabinski. Actually, not at the time, because this is recounted afterwards. Is that right?
No, he was a member. That was in 2003, 2004. He was a member of SEAL Team 6 at the time.
The title of your investigative expose in the Intercept is The Crimes of SEAL Team 6. The crimes. So you are putting this out at the end of the Obama administration. Talk about exactly what you found, the crimes as you've been telling us, and what you think should happen now.
I think that what this investigation has found, what I've found over the last couple of years, is that there was a consistent and persistent forms of largely mutilations and desecration of bodies in Iraq and Afghanistan, beginning in 2002, continuing all the way through at least 2011. To be honest with you, I don't think it's stopped. I think it might have lessened. I mean, I've got some indications that simply from the slowing down of the tempo of the wars, both in Afghanistan and then the pullout in Iraq, simply brought things mostly to a halt. There were a series of pretty horrific acts. We had canoeing, as we described, which is this particular type of firing a bullet into someone's head after they've been killed or are mortally wounded. Skinnings, which were done under the excuse of needing DNA and became sort of a cover to pull large sections of skin off of someone with a knife, using these specialized hatchets that were given to some members of SEAL Team 6 to hack bodies after they were killed or, again, dying. There were, frankly, a whole host of criminal activity, excessive violence, brutality, unjustified killings, some of which were not criminal in nature or intent, but were certainly problematic and poor judgment. And again, there is not a single case of punishment or legal action against any member of SEAL Team 6 in 15 years for accusations of unjustified killings in particular, or any atrocity or what would be deemed a war crime, mutilating a body. One thing that I didn't mention before, and one of the things that needs to be said is that what they were doing in large part was a form of psychological warfare. I spoke to several SEAL Team 6 members and people who worked with SEAL Team 6 who witnessed war crimes, who said that this was a message that they were sending, and they felt encouraged to send to al-Qaeda, to the Taliban, that they too fought dirty. And that, to me, was one of, I mean, in a large sense, this has been going on since the beginning of time in terms of warfare. But with such a professional force, it was really startling to hear that America's most heralded unit, the best of the best, the president's own, were so emotionally involved with this war and these battles that they felt the need to conduct a form of psychological warfare on the enemy. And what I took away from this investigation, what I hope happens, is that the senior leaders of the command who knew about it or should have known about it are held to account from the standpoint of their ability to be promoted. And I think we put the story out now. It comes at the end of the Obama administration. It is a very thorough accounting of what this unit became, first under President Bush and then under President Obama. And the senior leaders who knew about it, who failed to hold their men to account, are now senior people inside JSOC and Special Operations who end up being who President Trump will have at his beck and call to conduct operations. And that is the significance. The real significance here is a lot of this is history, but when no one gets punished and people get promoted, you're bringing that history forward, and you're saying to people who made decisions when they were, young officers who are now have stars on their lapels, who are making serious decisions for the United States, and making recommendations to the president about what they're going to do on a mission or in general on in a war zone. They are now in positions of great responsibility and authority, and there has been no accounting. So if there was something that we hoped could happen out of this, it would be that some of these people's careers would effectively end, not fired. There's very little chance that anyone will look back into and reopen these investigations. This is more about trying to determine whether particular officers who had served at SEAL Team 6 did their job, whether they did what they were supposed to do, which was provide law and order.
And the names of the officers you feel should be challenged.
There are three in particular that my story goes into. One is current Rear Admiral Hugh Wyman Howard, who is a one-star admiral at JSOC. Another is Rear Admiral, a two-star Tim Szymanski, who is the commander of WARCOM, which is the overall SEAL command out in California. It's effectively the highest-ranking SEAL, or the in charge of all Navy SEALs in the Navy, and Captain Peter Vaisley, who may in fact be have already made promotion to admiral, who also has a senior position inside JSOC. These are people who have, and by the way, we spent months, in some cases years, trying to get these people to answer questions, to talk to us. They refused. The military refused to respond to this story for 5 months with dozens of questions, specific questions, to get them to say, hey, we'd like your help here. And it was total silence. Total silence.
And your allegations of what Vaisley did?
Vaisley initially reported the beheading in Afghanistan in 2007, but effectively allowed Szymanski to cover it up. And so there was it was a very subtle way. He made sure that there were no charges, and there was pressure applied to him from above to make the charges go away, and he did his duty. He certainly was fully aware of what occurred in that room and walked away from it.
And Howard?
Howard's a very interesting individual. He is a descendant of an admiral, a long history of naval officers in his family, graduate of the Naval Academy, and Wyman. He's known as Wyman in the SEAL world. Wyman Howard was commander of Red Squadron, and he came up with the idea of purchasing $600 custom-made hatchets to give to his men because their unit insignia and moniker was a Native American warrior. They wear patches, they have tattoos. He thought it would be great to give them a hatchet and then encourage them to wear them on the battlefield. They had no military purpose whatsoever. And then he would tell some of his men and others that he wanted them to go out and bloody their hatchet. And it was largely a euphemism, but not unlike the way Britt Szymanski tells his men that he wants a head on a platter. What occurred was people started using those hatchets to hack bodies and commit war crimes with them. And Howard later became the overall commander of SEAL Team 6, and has had, frankly, quite a rising career. And when you look deeply at some of the things that happened under his command, it's quite disturbing. And that's the point. You know, no one has looked deeply at what's occurred.
And President Obama's knowledge of all of this?
Can't speculate. I mean, you know, on the bin Laden raid, obviously he has very good knowledge. But, you know, overall, my impression and what I've been told is that what was so, you know, in a way sinister about what occurred on the battlefield by SEAL Team 6 was their ability to suppress the information from getting out beyond, even to the admiral level or the general's level. They kept it in the unit. And so I don't know, you know, who knew or how many people knew. I certainly know that senior leaders at JSOC had an idea. They certainly, I've spoken to some officers from JSOC who said, we feared it, we had inclinations, but we never could prove anything. You know, I think that's probably largely true for a lot of people. We feared it, but we couldn't prove anything.
And Matthew Cole, the difference between your piece for The Intercept, your piece called The Crimes of SEAL Team 6, and the New York Times in the summer of 2015, SEAL Team 6, A Secret History of Quiet Killings and Blurred Lines.
The Times did a very good job of introducing the public to some of the darker side of SEAL Team 6, which, you know, that article was very well reported. And what it did was it raised a lot of questions, I think, but it didn't provide a whole lot of answers. And what I tried to do was get past that, which was there was a lot there. And their story in particular quotes on the record Britt Slabinski denying that he ever gave an order to kill all men on an operation, that the young SEAL who was cutting off the head of another of a militant had done anything other than having his knife slipped when he was trying to get, you know, military equipment off of a dead body. And my story pieces together what really happened. And one of the things that was so interesting was that SEAL Team 6 has essentially what we call a rock of shame. They have a rock that sits in one of their senior leaders' offices that has names of former SEAL Team 6 members that are no longer welcome to come to the command physically. And two names that are on there are Matthew Bissonnette and Rob O'Neill from the bin Laden raid because of their publicity. After the New York Times article was published, Britt Slabinski's name was added to that list. And I was talking to my source who had told me about it, and he was disgusted, but he said, and I think we quoted him in the story, he said, that's the problem with SEAL Team 6. They didn't put his name on after they blacklisted him for suspicion of war crimes. They put his name on after he went and spoke on the record and lied to the press. And you know, we felt we had to put that in there to explain sort of the full narrative of what the values are, sort of how the values are off at SEAL Team 6. The Times did a very good job with their story, but it didn't go far enough. It didn't go deep enough. And I won't speculate as to why. I'm glad that they did the story. I think we need to have more stories about SEAL Team 6 that are not putting them on a pedestal. They do great work. They do important things. I'm not vilifying them in any way, but they need to be held to account because the secrecy has insulated them, and their elite stature has insulated them from any kind of accountability or justice.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. As we turn to another of Donald Trump's picks for his cabinet, this piece in The Intercept is headlined, Trump's pick for Interior Secretary was caught in pattern of fraud at SEAL Team 6. In it, Matthew Cole writes, a Montana lawmaker tapped by President-elect Donald Trump to be Secretary of the Interior committed travel fraud when he was a member of the elite Navy SEAL Team 6, according to 3 former unit leaders and a military consultant. In announcing the nomination of Republican Congressman Ryan Zinke, a retired Navy SEAL commander, Trump praised his military background. He said, as a former Navy SEAL, he has incredible leadership skills and an attitude of doing what it takes to win. Matthew Cole, you dug deep into Zinke's history. Talk about what he did as a Navy SEAL and why ultimately he was forced out.
So Congressman Zinke was a member of SEAL Team 6 as a mid-career officer and junior officer in the 1990s. And he, during the war in Bosnia, in which SEAL Team 6 was assigned, he frequently came home to the United States after a deployment, and instead of coming back to Virginia Beach, would fly to Montana, where he's from, Whitefish, and work on a house that he had there that he was hoping to live in when he retired. And he did this several times and was warned, I think after one or two times, that what he was doing was travel fraud. He was expensing it to the U.S. government and calling it work when in fact it was personal. And he was warned verbally not to do it, and then he got caught doing it again. And after he shifted positions inside SEAL Team 6, the people who followed him discovered his paperwork and realized he had a long pattern of it. And so they brought it to the command's attention. And the command, this was in 1999 or 2000, before the wars, decided that he had to leave the unit. They were going to, spank him, but he wasn't going to. They weren't going to punish him or reprimand him in any way. And as one source said to me, that the commanding officer of SEAL Team 6 at the time said, "We don't want to punish him because it'll hurt his family. He's got a family, and he'll lose pay, and we don't want to do that. He's a nice guy." And so they wrote his evaluation report in such a way that he wouldn't be allowed into SEAL Team 6, but he could leave the unit and continue on in his career as an officer in the Navy SEALs. And that's exactly what happened. In a lot of ways, Zinke is sort of too small a crook to be nominated for Trump's cabinet. But it gets at the issue of integrity and leadership in SEAL Team 6, the officer corps. And here was someone who made some serious mistakes. And
explain further what he did and how many times he did it?
I'm not sure the specific number of times. We were told multiple times, or in the range of 4 or 5 times, he would fly out to Montana and claim that it was some kind of SEAL Team 6 related endeavor. Publicly, he has stated that these were training trips. My understanding is that he never claimed that they were training trips. And that, in fact, what he was doing was helping to rebuild or renovate a house that he intended to live in when he retired from the military. He's a native of Whitefish, Montana. So he got caught. I couldn't get a sense, actually, of, my sources couldn't remember because it was a long time ago, how much money was the total dollar figures. He has, in his 2014 campaign, to give him his side of it, he reported that he wrote returned a check to the Navy for something like $214 that covered a travel voucher that he did, and that he had been duly punished for this. He had made a poor decision. He didn't. He portrayed it as something that was justifiable, but that the Navy ultimately decided they wouldn't pay for. My sources, who were both contemporaries of his at the time at SEAL Team 6, as well as senior to him, said that was not an honest portrayal, that he, in fact, did it several more times than that and for higher amounts, and that there was nothing close to a justifiable reason for his travel. He was spending government time and resources for his own personal efforts on a home, essentially.
And so what kind of response, you wrote this in December, after, of course, Donald Trump chose him to be his nominee for Secretary of Interior. What kind of response did you get to your piece?
A lot of silence. I mean, Zinke has still never responded. The Trump team, the transition team, called me to say that they didn't dispute any facts in the story. They only said this was old news. And, they had confidence, the president-elect had confidence in the congressman.
They called you because you called them?
Yeah, we had sought comment before the story ran. They responded after the story published. Zinke's team never responded. There's been some response. Actually, a lot of people from Montana responded to our story on both sides, saying that he was honorable. Other sides saying that he was terrible. And he's their congressman, so it's a political issue. I think I do know, and it wasn't in this piece, but there is more to. He had some subsequent positions in the Navy SEALs that were there were some ethical flags raised in those positions as well towards the end of his career. And we may or may not get to those in the coming days. But this was not an isolated incident, is the sense that I have from talking to folks who were in the Navy with him.
And he was forced to leave?
He was effectively forced to leave SEAL Team 6. He was not officially forced to leave the Navy. He retired at retirement age.
And explain the difference.
The difference between being forced to leave versus...
Forced to leave SEAL Team 6, but not the Navy.
SEAL Team 6 has... And any unit can do this, but there are effective ways to get someone to move on, which is that when their time is up, when their pre-assigned task is over, their assignment, the evaluation is written in such a manner, as I understand it, that they cannot get another job within that command afterwards because of the way the evaluation is written. And so you're never fired, you are never dismissed, your time is up, and you are quietly told that you just won't be able to come back here. But no one else is told going forward in any other assignment that you get that that's what happened to you.
You write about a celebration, a reunion, really, of Navy SEALs back in Virginia at the headquarters. Describe where that is and what happened.
So each year in October, SEAL Team 6 has what it calls its annual stump muster, which is like a reunion, and it brings back old members of the command, original members of the command, people who've just recently retired, current members and their families, and it's a party. And my story ends with a former senior leader of the command who went back in October of 2011. The organization, the headquarters, had just completed a $100 million building and facility, and essentially we're christening it, and was under the command then of Captain Wyman Howard, had just taken over at SEAL Team 6. And he was, this former SEAL team leader was standing in a group with old friends, and he was handed a portfolio, a ring-bound book. And he opened it up, and someone said to him, this is our greatest hits. And he looked down, and they were a collection of canoed heads since 9/11. And what he realized, and I subsequently was able to confirm, was that this collection was not the private collection of some member of SEAL Team 6. This was the SEAL Team 6 official collection and photo book that they were sending around as entertainment at a private party, essentially, but out in the open. And the senior leader who saw it decided after he left, he was disgusted with what he saw and decided he was never going to, he has not gone back to the command for a reunion since, because of how upset he was with the lack of morality and the sort of bloodlust and glee, the gleefulness around essentially what is their professional work.
Matthew Call, I want to thank you for being with us, national security reporter for The Intercept. We'll link to his new exposé just out, The Crimes of SEAL Team 6. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.